Thank you very much, Phil, and good evening, everybody. I'd like to begin by just asking you to cast your minds back to the 20th of March. I'm sure you recall the 20th of March this year. You were celebrating. Do you remember what you were celebrating? Blank looks all around the room. World Happiness Day. Wasn't that the day when you went about telling everyone to cheer up? Was that perhaps the day when you tried to pretend just for one day that there were no shadows falling across your life, that there are no bereavements, no life-threatening illnesses, no friends who disappoint us, no relationships that fall apart? Perhaps you celebrated by chanting that mantra of positive psychology, the glass is half full. And we know the pessimists are supposed to say the glass is half empty. I'm drawn to the view of the engineer who looks at the glass and says, that glass is exactly twice as big as it needs to be. I think that's not a bad starting point, to be realistic. World Happiness Day, perhaps you ate more yogurt. My brand of yogurt boldly proclaims on the pack, happy inside, happy outside. And of course there's something in that. I don't know specifically about yogurt, but food is a great source of feelings of happiness and contentment and pleasure. We know that mood is strongly influenced by food. In fact, a recent UK study into the behaviour of a parole board found that prisoners coming before the parole board after lunch had a statistically significantly better chance of being granted parole than those who came before the board before lunch. So if you ever find yourself in this situation, make sure you get an afternoon appointment. Well, World Happiness Day. We have World Menopause Day. Why not World Happiness Day? Well, I'll tell you why not. Because the pursuit of happiness as it's evolved in Western society seems to me to have become one of the great distractions from the good life. Am I happy? Am I happy enough? Why am I feeling like this? Aren't I supposed to be happier than this? Why aren't I having more fun? Whatever happened to happily ever after? Isn't happiness supposed to be one of the symptoms of the good life? Well, there's nothing wrong with that list of questions that I just raised, and we all ask ourselves questions like that occasionally, maybe once or twice a year, but to be relentlessly concerned about your emotional state, and in particular whether it's positive, whether you're feeling happy, in other words, to become obsessive in the pursuit of happiness is to miss out on the thrill of what it really means to be human and the richness of all the emotional experiences that are available to us as humans. As it's popularly defined, happiness is just an emotion. It's just a feeling, one among many, and yet we are in the West, and specifically in Australia at the moment, inclined to give happiness this privileged status. We neglect the spectrum. We forget that many of the so-called dark emotions like disappointment, failure, loss, actually have much more to teach us than the bright, shiny, but essentially fleeting, ephemeral emotions like happiness and bliss and euphoria. Of course, our folklore reminds us that the dark stuff is vital. The folklore says, doesn't it, we grow through pain. And then when we experience the emotional pain, let's have another drink, let's pop a pill, let's smoke something in order to let this pain pass as quickly as possible. We forget that we're being taught something. You remember James Magnuson, the Australian swimmer who failed so spectacularly in front of the worldwide audience at the London Olympics in the men's relay. And you probably also remember that a day later, Magnuson said, I've learned more about myself in the last 24 hours than in the previous 24 years. Well, we know what he means. Now, this, of course, does not mean that we want to wish sadness or loss or failure or disappointment on ourselves or on our children. No one except a particular kind of neurotic goes in search of trouble, in search of suffering. We don't hope to fail so that we can learn the lessons of failure. But we just need to recognise that we're human and we will fail. And that all of these experiences and all of these emotions will come to us in their turn, and they will come to our children. Which is why I get profoundly irritated when I hear parents, particularly parents of young children, saying, "I just want my kids to be happy." Well, of course it depends what they mean by happy. Perhaps they're referring to the Aristotelian concept of happiness. The ancient Greeks thought of happiness, they had a word eudaimonia, which is translated roughly as happiness in the modern world. And that word meant being engaged with the life of the community, fulfilling your duty as a responsible citizen, sacrificing yourself to the common good, engaging with the full richness of human love and friendship. These were the terms that Aristotle was using. Well, we know about the full richness of human love and friendship, don't we? There's a lot of pain in it, a lot of disappointment, as well as a lot of joy and happiness. So if that's what parents mean when they say, "I just want my kids to be happy," I'm all for it. But I fear that is not what they mean. I fear what they mean is that they want their kids to experience the emotion we call happiness. And if that's what they mean, then of course I'd like to grab them by the shoulders and shake them till their teeth rattle, because I'd be wanting to say to them, really? You want your children to experience this narrow band of emotion? You want them only to get the bright stuff? You don't want them even to understand happiness by experiencing the contrast with sadness and disappointment and all those things. Of course, we don't want our children to be miserable. But to say, "I just want my children to be happy," is a really cockeyed thing to say. We know what just happy is like. I bet everyone in the room has been through periods of being just happy. It's called falling in love. And we're pretty dysfunctional when we're in that state. We bump into things and we make appalling errors of judgment, mainly about each other, when we're in that state. This is not a good state for people to be in long term. In fact, there's some very interesting research about the relationship between decision making, judgment, and mood. I attended a couple of years ago, I spoke at a happiness conference. Why they invited me to speak at a happiness conference, I don't know, because they knew my views. Anyway, the speaker who preceded me said, "Next time you're going to your doctor to get a diagnosis, give your doctor some chocolate before she or he makes the diagnosis, because this will lift their mood." And then I read some research published soon after by the University of New South Wales showing that people's decision-making is actually better when they're just feeling a bit blue, when they're just not feeling happy, when they're just feeling either neutral or a bit negative. So I thought chocolate is I've never given my doctor chocolate. That seems to be quite the wrong thing to do. But happiness is really one of a cluster of key words, which includes words like self-esteem and excellence and even perfection, which are really little symptoms of what I describe in the new book as a Western disease, which I call the Utopia Complex. This is the neurosis that life could be perfect, that we're driven by fantasies of perfection. Perfect teeth. I mean, this is the perfect time in our cultural evolution to be an orthodontist. Everybody wants their teeth to be straight and white, regardless of their age. Perfect breasts. Get into cosmetic surgery. That's a good business to be in at the moment. Perfect lattes, perfect kids, perfect marriages, and if the marriages are a bit imperfect, then of course perfect divorces. Everything has to be positive, positive outcomes. This is the kind of mantra of the Utopia Complex. Now you think I'm exaggerating? Well, not by much. Let me read you a sentence that I'm very proud not to have written. It comes from a book which you may have read, although probably haven't. If you're interested in a book like this one, you wouldn't have read that one. But the book is called The Storm Before the Calm, published in 2011. And this is a sentence from the book. The function of life is to recreate yourself anew in each golden moment of now, capital N for now, in the next grandest version of the greatest vision you ever held about who you are. Well, I read that and I thought, well, give us a break. You know, I was intending just to get on with my life, not to have all that. But our language has come to reflect this utopian view of life. It's become hyped up. You sign a credit card voucher and the waiter looks at this and says, fantastic, as though you've managed to negotiate the task of signing your name on a credit card voucher. Friday afternoon, everyone says, have an awesome weekend. An awesome weekend. I was planning to veg out, you know, read a book, perhaps even read a bad book. No, Monday morning you have to have your fabulous weekend story ready. Well, the victims of all this utopia complex are, of course, our kids and our grandkids. We can swallow our disappointments. We can cope with the realization that we've made fools of ourselves by chasing these absurd and unreachable goals. We can slink off to the therapist in search of a reality check. But our kids or our grandchildren don't get off quite so lightly. Imagine growing up in the utopian culture. Imagine growing up as anyone in really under the age of 30 has, grown up in a culture in which everyone is praised for everything. Gold stars for breathing, prizes for turning up, prizes for coming last, everybody is special. Self-esteem is the great currency. Self-esteem is the great gift we can bestow on our children, whereas we know there's a very big difference between self-esteem and self-respect. Self-esteem doesn't have to be earned at all. Anyone can experience self-esteem if someone keeps on telling them how wonderful they are, even if they know they're not. They can get carried away with this little delusion that everything is fantastic and that they are special and that they're marching into a triumphant future. Well, of course, this sets them up for disappointment, it sets them up for bewilderment and a sense of something missing, perhaps even having failed their parents. A wonderful article appeared in The Atlantic at the end of 2011, and I quoted it in the book, written by an American psychotherapist. The article is called How to Land Your Kid in Therapy. And it's a description of the young adults who are in the vanguard of this generation who've been constantly told they're special and given rewards and prizes for everything, and now coming to adulthood they're discovering sometimes you get a C or even an F in an exam and your boyfriend ditches you, and there are days or weeks when you just feel a bit blue and it doesn't seem to be quite as glorious as your parents told you it was going to be. And so you're a bit disappointed or puzzled, and you're also wondering whether you've let your parents down. Martin Seligman, the high priest of positive psychology, many of you will have read Seligman's work. And by the way, this is not an attack on positive psychology. It has a very important part to play in therapy. People who are suffering from depression and other forms of mental illness can benefit from some of the techniques of psychotherapy, of positive psychology. But for the population at large, it carries some very serious hazards. Anyway, Seligman, in his most recent research, has retreated very significantly from this idea that self-esteem is a great thing to give young people. The latest paper of his that I've come across, has drawn the very controversial conclusion that the best predictor of success in high school is actually self-control. Self-discipline. And Seligman says it's self-control, not self-esteem. And in fact, he says, self-control is a better predictor of all-round success at high school than IQ. Well, that's a very different story, and it's a story which is beginning to emerge, and yet we persist with this utopian madness, and in particular with the idea that happiness is the sovereign emotion, the default position. Why would we give any emotion that status? We wouldn't say sadness is the sovereign emotion, would we? Any emotion. Weird. Emotions are actually very easy to manipulate. Preachers do it, advertisers do it, politicians do it, parents do it, lovers do it, composers do it, actors do it, poets do it. Not hard to manipulate people's emotions. You can manipulate your own emotions by going to a movie that'll make you cry or laugh. And if you can't manipulate your emotions in any other way, well, there's a whole drug culture waiting to give you the emotional response that you're searching for. And it's no accident that the burgeoning so-called recreational drug culture has coincided with the rise in the happiness industry. Well, an important stepping stone to the good life is the realization that it's not happiness, but wholeness. The ability to identify, respect, accept, perhaps even embrace the full spectrum of emotions that come to us and learn from them all and from the contrasts between them. Now, I described happiness as the great distractor from the good life. There are, of course, many other distractions. Addictions of every kind will distract us. Addictions to anything, from gambling or alcohol to sex or information technology. The quest for certainty will distract us, because there is no certainty. An obsession with the future. A lot of people are constantly thinking about the next thing and what's going to happen next. Half live in the future. That will distract us from the good life in the present. Philip Larkin, the English poet, wrote a wonderful poem called Next Please. Some of you will be familiar with this. I'll just read you a few lines from Next Please. Always too eager for the future, we pick up bad habits of expectancy. Something is always approaching. Every day till then, we say. It is a distraction. It's a lovely story about the obsession with the future concerning Kenneth Arrow, who was an American economist, won the Nobel Prize for economics. And in World War II, as a young man, Kenneth Arrow was working as a weather forecaster for the US Air Force. And after some months of working in this role, he invited a statistician to look at the accuracy of the weather forecasts. And the statistician came to the conclusion that the forecasts were no more accurate than numbers drawn out of a hat at random. So faced with the evidence, Arrow wrote to his superior officer and said, the forecasts are useless, no better statistically than random numbers, so we wish to be relieved of this task. And the reply that Arrow received was, the commanding general is well aware that the forecasts are no good. However, he needs them for planning purposes. That will strike a responsive chord in some of you who work for organisations that rely on forecasts. Well, the future can distract us. The quest for power, status, wealth, fame. The quest for the meaning of life. There's a section in the book that encourages you to call off the quest for the meaning of life. Not the meaning of your own life, but the meaning of life with a capital L. The endless quest to find yourself. All of these things are little obsessions that can distract us. So if it's not about any of that, if it's not about an emotional state, what is the good life? Of course, you can define good in more or less any way you like, and the term the good life is used in lots of different ways. Well, you do use it economically, don't we? You say the good life is a life of prosperity and comfort and economic security, or we define it in emotional terms and say the good life is feeling good, having a good time and so on. Well, I'm not talking about any of that. I'm talking in the moral sense of the word good. So the good life is a life about goodness. It's a life that's morally praiseworthy, a life that's devoted to the common good. Now, throughout the book, I've used little sort of vignettes, little miniature short stories about various people that I've known personally or encountered in my research, just to illustrate the themes of the book. And I'd like to just read you a short extract from one of those stories about Vanessa. For 20 years, Vanessa has been reading about the sandwich generation, and now at 45 finds herself in the thick of it. Young teenage children still heavily dependent on her own increasingly frail parents relying on her for advice, support, reassurance, and even companionship. A husband who adores her and expects his fair share of adoration in return. With the children's schedules becoming even more complicated than her own, Vanessa finds running the household a daily challenge. Her husband tries to be supportive, but he's never been fully domesticated, though he has finally mastered the art of school lunches. Oh, and Vanessa has a full-time job that she wouldn't give up for anything. Raised by an enlightened mother to be a truly liberated woman, Vanessa revels in the knowledge that she is living a rich, full, if slightly overcomplicated life, and that life has bestowed many precious, magical moments on her. But her energy levels are depleted and she's beginning to feel desperate. There are times when her so-called liberation feels just like another form of enslavement. She's becoming almost obsessed by the thought of escape. A Buddhist retreat, perhaps, or a spa resort. Even a short stay in hospital seems attractive, provided it was nothing serious, obviously. The conventional family holiday wouldn't do the trick. That's usually more work than staying at home. One thing Vanessa wouldn't say about her life is that she's having a good time. She and her husband go out occasionally and always enjoy themselves, though he falls asleep in movies, and if they have dinner, they seem to have trouble sustaining a conversation about anything other than their kids or their parents. Life isn't meant to be like this, Vanessa sometimes mutters to herself. I never expected happily ever after, but I did expect to be getting more fun out of life. I expected to have more time for me. Well, someone needs to explain to Vanessa the difference between a good time and a good life, and to acknowledge something that she probably hasn't acknowledged herself, which is that she is precisely the kind of person who makes the world go round. This is a very good life indeed, but it's out of balance. She does need more time for herself. She does need to take up Pilates or yoga or join a book club or something, not to indulge herself, but to equip herself, to refresh herself in order to fulfill her destiny, because she's a human being, and therefore her destiny is to be engaged, to be living a life for the people who need her. And she's doing that. She's a loving and dutiful daughter, she's a responsible parent, a loyal wife, a good citizen, a conscientious employee. Yes, she's got to make some adjustments, but broadly speaking, Vanessa is an example of the good life, because the central truth about goodness in a life has to be acknowledged. That is, the good life is the life lived for others. Now, I'm not making that as an assertion, I'm not expressing that as an opinion. I'm going to offer you a logical proof of the proposition that the good life is a life for others. As long as you accept my first premise, then I'll lead you to the inevitable conclusion. Just ask yourself, what is the most powerful force for good in the world? What's the most fruitful, the most creative, the richest source of goodness in the world? And I'm sure the answer you would come up with is love. Not love as an emotion, not love as a feeling, but love as a motivation, love as a guiding principle, love as a sort of foundation for our lives. And of course, by love I mean charity, compassion, kindness, respect, tolerance, all of those things which we see as manifestations of this motivation to be loving. So the first proposition, the first premise in the argument is love is the source of goodness. The second premise is based on the proposition that love makes no sense in isolation. Unless you're a narcissist, you can't be leading a loving life unless you're engaged with other people. Love is about me and others. I'm giving it and I'm receiving it in relationships, in the context of families, friends, communities, neighbours, colleagues, etc. So, first premise, love is the source of goodness. Second premise, love is about engagement. It's about relations. Conclusion, the good life is a life for others. It's a life about engagement. It's a life in which love is given and received. And again, I emphasise, I'm not talking about romantic love, I'm not excluding that, but I'm talking about a loving motivation, a loving disposition. Well, what else could a good life be about than that? We've been sold a very silly story about human nature, particularly over the last 25 or 30 years, when it's kind of been generally accepted in the Western tradition that we are selfish creatures by nature, that everything we do is self-interested. That even if you appear to be behaving altruistically, that's really just to make yourself feel better. You help a frail old person cross the road, but that's really, I mean, yes, you're helping that person, but it's to make yourself feel good. Well, it seems to me when you look at the evidence about how we humans operate, that is just rubbish. We are an extraordinarily altruistic species. Yes, we are selfish. Yes, we can be aggressive and violent and ugly. And we, the same people, can be extraordinarily compassionate, caring, kind, and loving towards other people. Extreme acts of altruism, heroism, attract particular attention. A bloke on the north coast a couple of weeks ago who on his surfboard paddled over and saved someone else on the surfboard who was being attacked by a shark. And what did he say when he got to shore? And inevitably a journalist shoved a microphone down his throat and said, what did it feel like, etc. And he said, anyone would have done it. And that's what heroes always say, isn't it? I'm not sure about me in the case of the shark, I'm not sure I would have done that, but you see someone in difficulty in the water and you're standing on a wharf fully clothed, of course you jump in. You don't say, oh, I might get wet. There's a child saying, not your child, just any child. You pick up a wallet that's full of money. You don't just nick off with the money. Some people do, but most of us look for the owner of the wallet. That is just how we are. We volunteer. We care for people who are not our own, but who are total strangers. I was talking about this a couple of nights ago in a regional city, and a woman in the audience said, yes, my mother is a very frail elderly mother and she's almost blind. She gets around the town with a white stick. And people are extraordinarily helpful. In fact, she's been helped across several streets that she never intended to cross. Well, we're like that. Some people take refugees into their homes and help them to learn English and find a job and so on. We do extraordinarily helpful, kind things, unthinkingly helpful and kind. That's who we are. We're all the other stuff as well, but that's who we are. We belong to each other. And we know that instinctively. It's a genetic truth about us. Carl Rogers, my psychological hero, the founder of the client-centered therapy, School of Psychotherapy, said that in his consulting room, and he was dealing with wounded and troubled people, but he said in his consulting room, when people came to a realization of themselves, what they realised was that they are essentially social creatures, not individuals, that they finally can make sense of their lives in the context of their relationships. And that's, of course, true. So the good life is about us and others, and at its heart lies the most ancient wisdom of all, which I don't really even have to say, I'm sure, it's in your head. If you go back to the ancient Egyptians, the Greeks, the Chinese, follow the religious strands through Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Zoroastrianism, Hinduism, Buddhism, all the way through to A.C. Grayling and the modern secular humanists, they all say exactly the same thing about how we should live, about how the good life is expressed in human society. And of course, their principle, which used to be called the Golden Rule, is simply that we should treat other people the way we would like to be treated. Now, and there are lots of exceptions to that, and in the book I deal with all the justice has to be served, fairness, etc. Not everyone wants to be treated the way you would like to be treated. You have to know whether it's appropriate. Colonial powers have made all kinds of mistakes through history by treating other people the way they'd like to be treated without establishing what the culture gaps might be. But broadly speaking, every philosophical and religious tradition in human history tells you that that is the conclusion. And you didn't need any of that to tell you, did you? You just have to sit under a tree for 10 minutes and think about how a community can best work. How can a society function? How can a human society thrive? And you soon figure out that it will only work if we treat each other the way we would like to be treated. In other words, that we treat everyone else, we take everyone else seriously because we ourselves would like to be taken seriously. Well, if we lived like that, and we mouth it, but if we lived like that, a lot of our life, our social life would be transformed. Politics would be transformed. Does it seem completely beyond the bounds of possibility that politicians would treat each other the way they would like to be treated? That they would treat people on the other side of the chamber with the respect they think they deserve? It seems just a short step, doesn't it, to that, but it's a step that seems difficult to take. Business, professional sport, family life, community life, all of this would be transformed if we adopted that central principle that leads us to the good life. Well, it is hard to do because there is this tension. We are selfish as well as selfless. We are competitive as well as cooperative. And it's all a question of what's nurtured in us, what we choose to nurture in us and what we choose to nurture in our children. If you're looking for an example of how derailed the concept of the good life has become in modern society, just look at that ancient proverb, charity begins at home. And stop 100 people in the street. In fact, I should ask everyone in this audience what does the proverb, charity begins at home, mean? In the modern world, we tend to say, oh, it means first look after your own, and then when you've got that sorted, then you can start to be kind and generous to other people. It'd be amazing, wouldn't it, if ancient wisdom had fed us that as a principle? That's not what it meant at all. The origin of the proverb, it should perhaps have been translated as charity begins in the home. In other words, children have to have their charitable impulses, their altruism, their kindness, nurtured while they are young and at home, or else these impulses may never be nurtured. It's a proverb about child rearing. It's not a proverb about be selfish first and then be selfless. Again, I heard someone in discussing this concept in the last couple of days, saying that she thought she'd nurtured her children in this way, and she used to drop them at school and say, I don't want to hear anything else about what happened today except were you kind to people? And then when they got a bit older and were able to catch the bus, she schooled them in the proposition that if any older person got on the bus, you must get up and give your seat to the older person. And soon after, her kids rushed home, and the older sister said of her younger brother, a very old man got on the bus today, and Billy jumped up and offered him his seat. The bus was empty. Well, I hope the old man took Billy's seat to reward that behaviour. Of course, there are temptations constantly thrown in our path not to lead the good life and not to live according to the golden rule, but to embrace the materialist ethic or to pursue happiness as if that's all that matters. But all of that will distract us. So that's the good life. This book is not just another analysis of contemporary society, although there is plenty of that in it. And it's not just the philosophical argument that I've offered you tonight, although that's in there too. But it's a bit unusual to me in that it's really an appeal to us to take this idea a bit more seriously, to pay more attention to goodness in our lives, in our communities, to pay more attention to the moral value, the meaning we attach to our lives. And I'd like to conclude just by reading a couple of sentences from the postscript to the book, and then over to you if you'd like to ask any questions. But towards the end of the book I say this: the greatest monument to any of our lives will not be in stone, but in our living legacy, the influence we have had on other people at every point of connection with the human family. You don't have to be rich to leave a positive legacy. You don't have to be intelligent, famous, powerful, or even particularly well organised, let alone happy. You need only treat people with kindness, compassion, and respect, knowing they will have been enriched by their encounters with you. And that's what I mean by the good life. Thank you.